Let's turn our attention to the Conservative leadership contest, which has now opened, nominations opened, and to qualify, each candidate needs a proposer, a seconder, and 8 other nominations. This means a maximum of 11 candidates are possible. I don't think we've quite got there yet. So far, we've got James Cleverly, Tom Tugendhat, Robert Jenrick's team saying they already think they've got the threshold. Mel Stride also saying he reckons he's got the backing of 10 MPs, and leadership hopefuls have until 2:30 on Monday to get the names. We are presumably expecting more declarations over this weekend. Henry, I mean, how do you think this contest is shaping up? It's pretty wide open at the moment.
Yeah, so the two we're sort of waiting for are Priti Patel and Kemi Badenoch. I think rumor is that we're expecting Patel relatively imminently. No word yet from Badenoch. Suella Braverman was trying to put together a leadership campaign, but is apparently struggling to get the 10 nominations. I think that she grossly misjudged the initial response to the general election in terms of where the party was with regards to Reform UK. So it is an open contest. The interesting thing is how long the Conservatives have decided to run it. So the 1922 Committee of Backbench MPs, which decides the rules. Basically, the way it's going to work is that there will be a free-for-all throughout August when all of the candidates can campaign. And then there'll be an initial round of MP voting in sort of early September, which will winnow it down to a field of 4. That field of 4 will then go to Conservative Party conference, where apparently each of them will be given a chance to exhibit.
That's going to be a fun week.
Well, right. And this is the interesting thing, only then will MPs do another round of voting to winnow it down to a final 2, and that will be the member vote. Now, that's surprised myself and some other people, because we thought even if you had a long campaign, the sort of most logical thing would be to have the final 2 at conference, because that's the choice that members are going to make. So it seems a bit strange to have 4 candidates at conference presenting themselves to members and then have MPs sort of whisk 2 of them away before the final round. But I think the idea there is that it's the head-to-head, as we saw with Liz Truss versus Rishi Sunak in 22, that's most likely to get negative. So by keeping it with multiple candidates as long as possible, you're trying to keep things civil.
And I will bring in Polly in a moment, but keep things civil. Henry, are they going to manage to keep it civil when clearly each of them do need to define where they are different from their colleagues if they are going to try and emerge and convince MPs and the membership more widely to vote for them?
I think, as I said, it's easier when you've got lots of people, because it's when you've only got one opponent, then you've got your research book and there's a temptation to go negative. But it's harder to do that when there's 4 or 5 people in the race. So it's much easier to focus on the positives. The challenge is, in the modern world of 24-hour news and social media, it's very hard to have an internal contest, which is what this is, which is full and frank and has lots of debate and an honest confrontation with what went wrong, and doesn't turn into a public circus that's hugely damaging to the party. So it is going to be tricky. Most of the candidates do seem currently committed to keeping it civil. I think, again, one of Suella Braverman's problems is that she has broken this omerta.
And annoyed quite a lot of her colleagues.
And annoyed a lot of people. And I think there's a lot of people, even on the right of the party, who are thinking, do we want a race characterised by this sort of conduct, and saying no. So they'll manage it for now. Obviously, 3 months is a long time to maintain that discipline.
Yeah, I mean, Polly Toynbee, I certainly spoke to a couple of Labour MPs who think this is fantastic news for the new Labour government, because they're reasonably confident that while the Tories are still trying to work out who's going to lead them and exactly what they stand for, it's going to be very difficult for them to start landing any significant opposition to the Labour government.
I think that's true. For people who've become addicted to politics as game show, which is pretty much what we've had ever since the referendum in 2016, for 8 years of the Conservative Party providing wonderful entertainment if people want politics to be fun. Labour is very intent. Who knows what dramas there might be? You never know what's in store. But they're intent on trying to make politics serious, sober, about everyday policies and getting things done. And so there will be entertainment right the way through to November. And I think it will get noisy. If Priti Patel and Kemi Badenoch come in, which I'm sure they will, they're both very abrasive characters. The idea that they're both going to be extremely civil and quiet, polite, they're not by nature, nor I think is Robert Jenrick. Tugendhat has shown he's a bit of a swiveler in that he he was meant to be the candidate for the One Nation people, but he's already talking about, umming and ahhing about pulling out of the ECHR, which is likely to be a big dividing point between the
The
right
European Convention on Human Rights, just to make it
and
clear.
the and if that's the big issue that divides the Tory right and the Tory left, you would hope that by the time you get to the last two, members can choose between a Tory right and a Tory left. If they're given two right-wingers, then they'll choose a right-winger.
Who do you think, Polly, Sir Keir Starmer would find the toughest opponent to be the next Tory leader?
I think probably James Cleverly, who's very well liked. He's very likable. He's polite. He's not abrasive. He's had all the big jobs. I don't think it's a brilliant lineup, but if I were Keir Starmer, he'd be the one I think who'd worry me.
Henry Hill, when you look at these contenders and the likely contenders, we're expecting to hear probably from Priti Patel and Kemi Badenoch, presumably in the next day or two, as to whether they're going to run. Where do you think the Tory party should be looking as it's trying to find some kind of effective leader to unite this shattered party?
Well, I think the thing about unity is a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, it is sort of axiomatically true that divided parties don't win. But on the other hand, as we've seen with the Sunak period in government, if you focus purely on unity, you don't get anything done, because you end up with people who are unhappy about anything you try and do, and so you don't do it. And if you look historically at the really successful prime ministers, be that Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher, they tend to get unity because they're successful, and they have a strong vision, and most MPs are prepared to row in behind it, provided the leader is winning. I think that in terms of this contest, what the Tories need is somebody who's actually going to make a success of the job of opposition. And I think that one thing that slightly concerns me is that a lot of Tory MPs in the current cohort do not remember being in opposition. They've only ever been in Parliament when the Conservatives were in government, and that meant that it was easy to get, say, media attention. A random meeting of Conservative backbenchers would be a story. Whereas now, especially after the leadership convention has died down, and especially once Labour starts having its own internal battles over this, that and the other, the party is going to have to fight for every scrap of airtime. It has to rebuild its campaigning machine. There's a lot of sort of guts and machinery stuff that you really need to focus on, and if I remember, I would focus on that. But you also can't entirely divorce that from the ideological side. Currently, we've got a lot of people saying, well, it was all about competence. And that's fine, that is true. But you can't divorce competence completely from your ideas about how the country works. And I think it's problematic, because obviously we don't want to have a complete ideological bloodletting, but on the other hand, you can't completely ignore ideas in a Conservative leadership contest.
Let me just ask you, Henry, about the way this contest is going to play out, because when we do come down to the autumn and we get down to the two final candidates, it is then the Conservative Party members around the country who will get a vote. I mean, that was the system that gave the Conservative Party Liz Truss as leader. There was some talk after the last election of perhaps we need to change the system. Of course, it's very difficult for a defeated leader like Rishi Sunak to say, oh, well, I'm going to change the leadership contest now. Do you think that there are risks in the way that's going to play?
So the important thing, it is very easy to blame the membership, but the important thing about the Conservative model versus the Labour model, because in Labour you get genuinely, I think, 4 or 5 candidates can go through to the members. And so you can get somebody going through with a relatively small share of the vote. Whereas in the Tory system, it's only 2, which means that MPs have a responsibility to make sure that both candidates are acceptable. And ultimately, the reason that the Tory members were able to vote for Liz Truss is because Conservative MPs put her in the final 2. So I don't think obviously I don't think she was a great Prime Minister, but it was Tory MPs who put her there, and they have to share the blame for that. The interesting thing about the leadership vote is, William Hague, who instituted it in the first place, it only goes back to 1998. He's saying, actually, I made a mistake. But it was instituted as a sop to the membership when William Hague gutted the Democratic Conservative Party. It used to be, for example, the voluntary party controlled conference. It used to be that associations had much more freedom to choose their own candidates. And anyone who wants to take away the members' vote, I think my question to them is, okay, then what are you going to do to restore the democratic institutional Conservative Party if you take that away?
And just before we have to move on, clearly we're still waiting to hear from potentially Priti Patel and Kemi Badenoch, and we wait to see whether Suella Braverman does nonetheless emerge and join the field. It is very early days, but Henry, Who at the moment do you think is looking like the likely contender, or you can even give me the likely final two contenders?
So I think the normal dynamic in a Conservative leadership contest is the final two is a candidate of the right versus a candidate more of the One Nation wing. And at the moment, I would say that the favourite to get the One Nation slot is Tom Tugendhat because he has a big lead amongst MPs. And then I would say that the right-wing final two slot would probably end up being between Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, because I think that Suella is struggling for the reasons we've described, and Priti Patel is going to really struggle because she was Home Secretary when Boris Johnson used Brexit to massively liberalise immigration. And for a right-winger, that is a really problematic policy legacy to have to defend.
Just one final point on Priti Patel. Does she not perhaps have an advantage of not having been particularly high profile under Rishi Sunak and during the most recent Tory governments?
Yeah, absolutely. Potentially, there are downsides to other candidates, but I think she was in office when Boris Johnson instituted the system that saw net immigration reach 750,000 people. And if you're running for the right-wing slot in the Conservative leadership contest, that is a very problematic thing to have to explain away.